The phrase "never again" has been used for decades as a symbol of international resolve to never allow an abomination like the Holocaust to happen again. All nations seem to recognize an obligation to stop future genocides and mass atrocities, even if it means violating the near sacred sovereignty of another country. That resolve has been tested many times, and too often it has failed. Since the Holocaust, we've seen mass killings take place the world over. In some cases, the slow, deliberate killing of innocent people may have only captured the news media's attention on occasion, leaving us with the impression that mass killings only happen in the context of war. What might have seemed like isolated incidents are symbolic of a larger epidemic. Personal stories from survivors give us a glimpse of the horror faced by the victims. The Voices of Rwanda project captured this testimony about the Rwanda genocide from a 72-year-old woman named Adele.
Bataratangira no gukora baba batsinze mu nzira ntibagezeyo bajya budosoresore bagira ngo barinyakwe bagiye n'ijuru ubwo rero ku manywa nibwo twagiye ku mugoroba nyine ijoro ryose ariko bagenda bararika imirara abitura hasi biruka abasore baguca hejuru uw'imbere bamwica uw'inyuma agahita uw'inyuma bamwica gutyo sinzi icyadutambukiye tubona tugeze kuri duwane abataye abana ufite impuhwe akabatora nuko
I do believe that the more often we say never again and then again it happens, the more the level of guilt rises and shame that we have failed again. And I think with the increase in the level of guilt, there is also a commensurate increase in the determination to correct our past failures.
Much of the world's past failures in preventing mass atrocities have been due to the lack of early preventive strategies by governments and the international community that can build much-needed capacities within countries and make it harder for leaders to resort to violence. We have seen a handful of success stories, however, and a certain amount of progress in how international law addresses these complex situations.
Well, in 2008, the international community very deliberately and proactively engaged in Kenya through mediation based on R2P principles. In Libya, more recently, we saw the Security Council invoke the responsibility to protect in authorizing military action against Colonel Gaddafi and his attacks against civilians. What was notable in both these cases is this sense of responsibility expressed by the international community. Libya and Kenya were really early crisis interventions. What we really need is prevention. We need a strategic approach to early prevention that really builds the institutional capacities such as a healthy security sector with professional and accountable police forces, a fair criminal justice system, and so on, that makes it much more difficult for political leaders to manipulate identity politics and other social tensions for their own strategic aims.
Prevention is difficult because there is no glory or no recognition in prevention. When you are effectively preventing a crisis, nothing happens, right? And if nothing happens, you can't get credit for it. That's part of the problem. You can't even fundraise for it because nothing has happened. But prevention, indeed, is the best approach.
Well, we do have the definition of genocide in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. And it comprises a number of actions which aim at the destruction of a group identified either as a national group, a racial group, ethnic or religious group, and with the intent to destroy in whole or in part.
It's important to understand that mass atrocities are not spontaneous explosions of ethnic hatred. That's the way they've been characterized quite often, but the reality is that political leaders mobilize identity conflict and other social tensions for their own objectives and purposes. And that means it can be prevented.
Well, first of all, we have to emphasize prevention, and preferably structural early prevention, based on how we manage diversities of identity. And if you look at it that way, then the first order of responsibility becomes that of the state to protect its own people. Now, if for whatever reason the state doesn't have the capacity and needs support from the international community, to then call on the international community to assist. The flaws become visible when you have a history of violence, a history of discrimination, a history of even past genocides, gross inequalities among groups. And if you can therefore intercede in a positive way early, before situations escalate and positions harden and denial sets in, then you can engage governments and perhaps neighbors and the international community in the end to help build the capacity of a given country by enhancing its means, rule of law, responsible police system, and by and large give them the confidence that they don't have to be defensive in a violent, destructive way, and they can be proactive in creating conditions that are preventive.
So we try as much as possible to act early, to focus on prevention, because we realize once these things start to unfold, putting them back the way things ought to be, stopping them in mid-flow is not so easy to do. But if you can prevent it at the beginning, you can save a lot of lives potentially, and also have a wider range of options.
Even countries many consider to be stable can descend into chaos. Case in point, Kenya. In the weeks following Kenya's disputed presidential election in December of 2007, the country's long-simmering ethnic and social tensions boiled over into violence. More than 1,000 people died in rioting and extrajudicial killings by police.
It wasn't just the election, but the election was the trigger. Sometimes countries just reach a tipping point where they expect change, and elections often are vehicles of change. And then when those elections are rigged or stolen, then of course people say, that's it, we have no other alternatives, and violence breaks out.
In Kenya, it was an election many voters presumed opposition leader Raila Odinga would win. Instead, after suspicious delays in the vote tally, incumbent President Mwai Kibaki declared victory. That ignited violence between the country's two largest ethnic groups, Kibaki's own Kikuyu tribe and Odinga's Luo. A mediation led by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan helped end the violence with a tenuous power-sharing agreement. In retrospect, many consider it to be one of the first applications of the responsibility to protect principle, also known as R2P.
Here we had the first proper illustration of what an R2P effort could deliver. It did illustrate that, yes, political action can contribute successfully to contain a crisis, to save lives, and it was a successful illustration of what R2P really meant on the ground.
As ongoing violence in Libya continues, the UN is demanding that the government put an end to the brutality.
Gross violation of basic human rights will not be tolerated.
Saturday saw the UN Security Council impose wide-ranging sanctions on Libya, including freezing the assets of leaders and an arms embargo.
In 2005 at the World Summit, all the heads of state and government agreed to the responsibility to protect. Namely that they would protect their populations by preventing genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and also their incitement. And they talked about the Security Council and other measures for trying to do something about that.
So sovereignty as responsibility has the three phases: state responsibility, support for the state, and ultimately international action to fill the vacuum of responsibility. Now, that concept has evolved into what we now call the responsibility to protect. And the responsibility to protect has those three pillars also: state responsibility, building the capacity of the state, and the international community taking collective action where the states are manifestly failing.
When states manifestly fail to protect their populations, it's up to the UN Security Council to make timely and decisive action under the responsibility to protect.
Now, that may be working with regional and sub-regional groups, may not be the Council by itself. It may be diplomatic measures, statements. It might be a question of trying to exclude a particular government from participation. It might be restrictions on the travel of the leaders who are causing the problems. It might be freezing their assets or the assets of their family financially. It might be preventing arms from flowing to them. It might be a question of trying to impose economic sanctions of one sort or another. Or in an extreme case, it might even be taking military action in a collective way to try to stop this kind of violence.
At the Human Rights Council in Geneva, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, urged the international community to put pressure on the Libyan government to end the violent clashes, saying those responsible for deaths must be held accountable.
Many people have really taken the action that was taken in Libya and Security Council authorization of that action as proof, as evidence that R2P has really been internalized by the international community and that they feel this sense of responsibility. But it's really important not to conflate this sort of intervention, military intervention, with R2P as a framework. Military intervention in all cases is really the failure of preventive efforts, and the emphasis of R2P is on peaceful prevention before atrocities actually begin.
But intervention is not an easy option because if you use force, you are likely to sacrifice a lot, and therefore there's a great deal of reluctance from the countries with the capacity to intervene militarily to do so because they don't want to sacrifice their young ones, which is why we have to double our efforts in favor of prevention.
There actually are a lot of efforts that are underway to sort of get ahead of political violence and work with atrocity threats before they become imminent. There's been quite a bit of investment on Pillars 1 and 2 of the Responsibility to Protect framework, particularly in southern Sudan and Kyrgyzstan. We saw after decades of civil war in Sudan that really manifested very heavily against civilians as major mass atrocity violence. As the Southern Sudan referendum has come into play, the international community has invested greatly in this peaceful transition to an independent Southern Sudan, which was considered inevitable by most observers. In addition to that, following the violence in June of last year in Kyrgyzstan, there have been a lot of key global players that invested in stabilization support, trying to diffuse some of those lingering atrocity risks that remained after the violence subsided, and create a more stable basis on which to build for the future.
The United Nations is in the midst of another experiment aimed at building capacity within troubled countries to prevent a return to conflict. It's called peace building.
I think everybody knows something about peacekeeping. You know, the pictures of the blue helmets have become now, almost a everyday event on TV screens. But peace building is less known. Peace building basically is the stage where a country has achieved some stability, sometimes thanks to the peacekeepers' presence, where they're now ready to move on to building state institutions, to building up civil society's role in a country under peace, to putting back people to work, to bring back basic services to a country that has been suffering from lack of it, from everything from health to water, to demobilize soldiers and insurgents that are now ready to lay down arms.
The Peacebuilding Commission has existed for about 5 years now. Its support office administers about $80 million a year in peacebuilding support to the 6 countries on the Peacebuilding Commission's agenda, as well as 12 other countries that are also transitioning out of conflict.
Liberia, one of the newest countries to request support from the Peacebuilding Commission, is still recovering from a 14-year civil war that ravaged the country's infrastructure and left an entire generation without an education. The UN maintains a force of 8,000 peacekeepers and 1,300 police stationed in Liberia. That force, however, will be drawn down significantly provided upcoming elections are peaceful. Liberia will be the first country to undergo a full transition from UN peacekeeping to UN peacebuilding.
It's crucial that we get it to work here in Liberia. Also because Liberia is the first country on the agenda where we have the peacekeeping mission and the peace-building commission working side by side. So we can really, in practice, show that you have to build the peace while you keep the peace. We are working very, very hard to try and make Liberia a success story. I can promise you that. And I have a personal interest in demonstrating it.
The peacebuilding process will focus on security sector reform, rule of law, and reconciliation. The goal will be to create regional justice centers throughout Liberia's rural areas, giving many people access to police protection and the courts for the first time.
What they're going to do specifically with that is to enhance our police work, and it's going to support the establishment of 5 regional hubs. That's going to be a multi-security facility, one of which ground has broken. Well, they'll have the police, the immigration, courts, and everything in one place in 5 of our major regions. And we think that's going to help us a whole lot because we'll provide housing for the security people, something which is lacking today that does not encourage them to go into rural areas. They all tend to come and concentrate in the capital city.
The hope is that by bringing government to the people and creating the institutions that promote peace and stability, Liberia will never return to war or allow identity-based politics to be stoked into mass atrocities or worse.
Now, the peace without the capacity building is very difficult. And you know, the locals here, they have fought a civil war for long 14 years. They did not have education. And infrastructure, as you can see, roads and others are all broken. Now, I hope that in Liberia also, the people are peace-loving. They don't want any more war. Hopefully, with the next election, things might settle down and they will be able to stand on their own feet.
I want to underline very much that you can keep the peace, but if you don't build the peace, then history has shown us from so many other theaters that the moment you then withdraw the peacekeeping mission, then if the underlying issues for the conflict has not been addressed in the meantime, the risk of the conflict erupting again is very high. When you go around the country, when you talk with people, when you see the eagerness of the Liberians in sending their children to school, if you see how they are really trying to build a future for their children, I sure hope it's a sign that they want peace and they don't want to get back to the atrocities that happened during the Civil War.
But we look forward that in 10 years we'll have a country where we'll be governed on the basis of the rule of law. We'll have a country that will respect human rights. We'll have the country that will respect all the necessary tenets of democracy. We'll have a country that will be able to meet the social, the economic and social needs of its people. We have a country that every Liberian, even the average Liberian, will be able to live and live happily.
What we need is a comprehensive international strategy that puts as much emphasis on early pre-crisis prevention as it does on sort of the immediate crisis that's unfolding in the day. And that's sort of the early preventive work is part of what we're lacking. There is a lot of work already being done by individual member states, by the UN, that really looks at institution building and focuses on good governance, rule of law, helping societies become healthier, more resilient, more stable. And all of that work in some form or another contributes to preventing atrocities. But what sort of is lacking is a clear understanding of what is unique about atrocity violence, about how this type of violence is different from all the other crises that societies that are under stress can possibly experience, and how these unique dynamics should tailor and impact our overall prevention efforts.
The international community, and most notably the United States government, is coming around to this idea. In recent years, the U.S. has put a greater emphasis on its soft power influence in the world, revamping its diplomatic and development strategy to better predict and prevent mass atrocity violence.
It's not enough to have an office buried down in one part of the bureaucracy or another that has a difficult time getting people to come to meetings. You've got to put it at the highest level. And in the Obama administration, that's been characterized by the establishment of a directorship within the National Security Council, someone who works in the office close to the President of the United States, but in the security part of it, the same sort of operation that coordinates our planning in military operations.
I would say that one of the things we've seen over the last several years is an increased attention and promise placed to the whole issue of how does one go about preventing mass atrocities, genocide type activities, using a lot of different tools within the United States government, really focusing on conflict prevention as a key mission of the State Department.
The U.S. government is working to better identify the factors that lead to mass atrocities, to ensure they have the tools needed to prevent them. It's also working to distinguish between conflict prevention and atrocity prevention, which can require two different approaches.
That's a very important distinction now, and I think one of the things that as we actually develop our approach within the State Department and within the government is we have to recognize that conflict and atrocity prevention aren't quite the same thing. Additionally, you need to be in there dealing with responsibilities. Who's doing the raping? Who's doing the killing? Do we ignore that because it's inconvenient, because we don't want to call that particular leader a butcher? No. We insist that there be a human rights office that does an investigation, that consults both sides, that publishes its results, that insists on both sides disciplining their soldiers or militia members, etc., for committing human rights violations.
In a new position in the U.S. State Department, the coordinator of reconstruction and stabilization, Ambassador Loftus, works to promote conflict prevention, reconstruction, and stabilization efforts. He and his staff help ensure the mechanics to prevent conflict or atrocities are in place at critical periods.
One of our keys is that the United States doesn't do this alone. I mean, it's not just working with the host government, host society, but it's working with our international partners, it's working with the United Nations, it's working with the African Union, I mean, whomever the players are out there.
Key to atrocity prevention is helping to build the capacity or basic foundations a country needs to prevent violence in the first place. In addition to a functioning electoral system, a fair judicial system, and professional security services free from corruption are crucial.
The judicial process in every one of these countries is almost always broken well before the atrocities are committed. I mean, quite often you have in lesser developed countries justice not having a very high priority. In some places still working with the resources that it has. In other places entirely biased, controlled entirely by one group.
Emphasizing genocide and atrocity prevention in U.S. diplomacy and development efforts is still a new concept, and lessons are being learned along the way. The key to success will undoubtedly be a commitment by the United States to work with its allies and sustain these new efforts for years to come.
The involvement of the United States or the involvement of the international community in helping people resolve these conflicts and getting ahead of the game is absolutely critical. If people know that there are outside entities who are interested and willing to help, it gives strength to those who want to move that process forward. Second point is that we as outsiders are not going to control events. We have to find those people within a society who are truly working to resolve this conflict and rebuild societies, and we need to work with them and make sure that they are the ones who are carrying this work forward.
Political consensus continues to grow in the United States and around the world that mass atrocity crimes must be more effectively addressed. Of course, many questions remain about what policies work best and how international actions can be coordinated to best protect those whose lives are in danger. The United States and the international community are also beginning to understand how to provide stability and build the kinds of societies and leadership which reject mass violence as a political tool. With these evolving understandings comes a growing hope that future efforts will better protect populations under threat and give new resolve to our promise of never again.